everyone to this afternoon's session of the Levelling Up Housing and Communities Select Committee inquiry. It's the first of our sessions into the regulation of social housing. We have two panels this afternoon. Before I come on and introduce the first panel, I'll ask members of the committee to put on record any interest they may have that may be particularly relevant to this inquiry. I'm the Vice President of the Local Government Association. Let's go round. Ian Byrne.
Yeah, I'm still a sitting councillor in Liverpool.
Right.
I'm a member of Bedford Town Deal Board.
Okay. Richard Hopkins.
I'm a Vice President of the Local Government Association and I employ a councillor in my team.
Bob Blackman.
I'm a Vice President of the Local Government Association and I employ a councillor in my office.
Matt Vickers.
I have family members who are councillors and employ a councillor in my team.
Okay, and Mary Robinson.
I employ a councillor in my staff team.
Okay, that's put on record the interest that we have that may be relevant to this inquiry. Now I'm come over to our panel, first panel of witnesses. Welcome all of you, and I'll just go down the list and ask each of you to introduce yourselves, just say who you are and the organisation you're representing today. First of all, Darren Hartley. Darren.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Darren Hartley. I'm the Chief Executive of the Tenant charity TAROE Trust.
Suzanne Mooner.
Hi, everyone. My name is Suzanne Mooner, and I'm the Secretary of the Social Housing Action Campaign.
And Pat Turnbull.
Hello, Pat Turnbull here. I'm a regional representative of London Tenants Federation.
Okay, thank you all very much for coming this afternoon to talk to us about the important issues of social housing regulation and some of the challenges that tenants, who you're all representing in different ways, are facing at present. So, can I begin with some questions about the condition of social housing, your experience of it, and the failures maybe in particular for some social housing providers to respond to tenants' requests for repairs in a proper and timely manner. There's obviously some examples been highlighted of pretty bad performance by some social housing owners, local authorities and housing associations. But despite those bad examples, how widespread do you think poor quality housing is and poor practice by social housing landlords to deal with repairs in a proper manner? I'll just go down first of all, our witnesses in the order that I introduce them and ask for their comments on that. Darren Hartley, first of all.
Thank you. I should just thank the committee as well for giving me the opportunity to present at this afternoon's session. I guess I should probably start with a caveat to highlight that the focus of TAROE Trust, often when we're approached by tenants to assist them, it's at the point of when tenants are in kind of almost a dire straits position. They're not sure who to go to, how to get the issues which they've maybe previously raised with their landlord addressed. So I think some of the issues that we deal with are not necessarily representative of the sector overall, but clearly do provide perhaps a tip of the iceberg of where things do go wrong, of some of the kind of poor conditions which tenants within the sector are living in. And our experience in recent years suggests that some of those conditions have deteriorated over time. I think I'll probably divide it into two areas. There's the physical quality, and then there's the service standards. And I think some of the contributing factors on the physical side, physical condition of properties, are related to, we've got decent home standard which is developed in the late 90s and is quite out of date now. It was reviewed in circa 2005. There's then the Regulator's home standard, which again is based more about broad principles, but it's one of the consumer standards, and I'm sure we'll return to this as the discussions go on, but which they're inhibited in terms of the regulation on the consumer side issues. And then I think on the service standards side of things, there are some challenges which we're seeing more recently, again perhaps based on anecdotal evidence. But if I give an example of one recent case which we dealt with, which was about damp and mold conditions, it went on for a long period of time, and And during that period, the landlord was blaming lifestyle issues of the tenant themselves who were living in the properties, only subsequently to identify that there was a problem with the physical condition of the property. And I think that what it highlights is that some of the cultural issues about, it's easy to kind of jump to say, oh, well, it's about a lifestyle issue, as opposed to condition of some of the properties. So I think if there were three areas where there's potential contributing factors, there's the restrictions continuing on the regulator and the scope of which the work they can do. There's the economic focus, which have perhaps pushed particularly the housing association as the regulated providers side of things, to push sweating their assets into building new properties, perhaps in some cases at the expense of investments in existing properties. And then I think there's a whole other kind of parcel of issues that could be undressed there around commercialization and digitization of services.
I think we're going to come back to some of those issues in more detail and with further questions. I think you're just trying to focus on, how bad the problem is. Is it some landlords have got really bad examples, but it's not so widespread, or is it widespread, this problem of poor repair services, poor response to requests for repairs? Suzanne, what's your experience?
Thanks. And just to be really clear, where we represent members, it is on the housing association side. Some of our members are private renters or council, but the vast majority are on the housing association side. So all of my contributions will relate to those. Like with the TAROE Trust, we've seen, really horrendous examples of kind of damp and mould. They generally are structural problems, and the housing associations tend to be reluctant, therefore, to make it's quite expensive in some cases to address them. But they will leave their tenants and residents in truly horrendous conditions. The other issues are around security. So having gates, security gates that work properly, the door entry systems that work properly, and locks on the doors, getting those repaired when those go wrong. Addressing antisocial behaviour, there was again some very, very bad examples where for long periods housing associations were warned that there was an antisocial behaviour issue, and failed to do anything about it. So they're not taking, as you mentioned to address it. And also where I believe what we are seeing in some cases, so I would put Clare House, for example, Clarion's Clare House in this example, is where we see a managed decline of an estate with what we believe is an eye to regeneration. So to push the social housing tenants out, and this of course fits into the kind of stigmatisation point, but actual, social cleansing going on. I would say that in discussing this, we can't really look at this issue without looking at how the complaints are handled, and it needs to be, how that is relevant to the regulator is obviously how they monitor and ensure that complaints are handled very quickly, because going to the regulator and making a complaint to the regulator or the Ombudsman takes too much time. There is, in a lot of these cases, serious urgency. If you've got water coming down through your light fittings, you need to have something done about it quickly. If you haven't got a boiler and you've got a newborn baby, you need to have something done about it quickly. And the complaint system are often just not acting. They are torturously long and protracted. And so it's very, very difficult for our members. One of the biggest complaints is that they didn't get something addressed in a timely way. So it's actually that response rate that has to be factored in, I think.
Okay, we'll come back with questions on the Ombudsman and the regulator in due course, but I think you were highlighting the Clarion issue there. I think that's the one that ITV News did quite a few programmes on, and I think they're still following that up, and that certainly highlighted some pretty shocking examples of repairs not being done on that particular estate. I think it was Eastfields, wasn't it? But let's move on to Pat then. Pat, what have you got to tell us about your experience of repairs not being done, of other complaints procedures not being carried through properly?
Well, the first thing I want to do is to introduce London Tenants Federation.
Yes, of course.
The tenants organisation it is. We're a delegate organisation, and we represent tenants and leaseholders in council properties in London boroughs, tenants of housing associations, members of co-ops and members of tenant management organisations. And we feel that democratically constituted tenants and residents associations and delegate bodies at regional and national level are the only way to guarantee a strong voice for tenants, and that strong voice is essential to ensure that we're all well housed. So we are very sorry that tenant organisation is so much reduced compared to what it once was. So we used to have many London borough federations, and we have very few now. And there used to be quite a lot of regional federations around the country like ours, and now we don't know of any, to be honest. Now, to come to the question of how bad is social housing when it is bad, well, just like private housing, when it is bad, it's very bad. And this is where there have been a lot of examples in the press, and we do refer to them in our submission. So, for example, ceilings collapsing, water running down walls, covered with black mould, people unable to turn their electric lights on in parts of their homes because it's dangerous. And of course, a lot of this is affecting families with children who are living for months and even years in these conditions. But London Tenants Federation wants to pose the question, what's the reason for it? Because it seems to us that you have to look for the reasons before you can find solutions. Because the strange thing is, all the people we're talking about are paying for the service. Social rents are not cheap, however they're categorised. In April last year, people in social rented housing were paying an average of 34% of their incomes on their housing, and these are often very low incomes. And many social housing tenants, including those in work, need benefits to be able to pay the rent. So I just want to mention that's why we're very much opposed to the 30 years of inflation plus 1% rent rises that the London Council and the G15 are asking for. So to come down to why, and the Eastfields estate has already been mentioned, this is in Merton in South London, and this estate was stock transferred from the council to a predecessor of Clarion. The trouble is, and I think Sue's mentioned this, that it looks as if Clarion just sees Eastfields not as people's homes for which they have a responsibility, but as an area of prime real estate which is ripe for redevelopment, or regeneration as it is called, which means knocking down these social rented homes and replacing them largely by homes for sale in the private market. And they're not alone in doing this. These regeneration schemes are going on all over London, and more are planned. We fear, as Susan actually mentioned in passing, all right, it might even be Darren, that the quality of housing on estates regarded as ripe for regeneration is often deliberately run down to make it easier to persuade the residents that demolition is the only answer. And we know of cases where that has actually happened. And so asking for a ballot is a kind of, well, if you give a ballot to people who haven't got any options, what do they say? I want to go back to Clarion again as an example. They reported on 17th of January 2021, or rather Inside Housing reported, that Clarion had seen its net surplus rise by 29% to 100 million, despite spending a further 18.6 million in fire safety costs. And they are not the only housing association operating a large surplus. Surely this should be spent on the social rented homes, on their upkeep. So we find it disappointing that Clarion has received the largest amount of grant funding from the Mayor of London's office, in spite of the number of cases of poor maintenance. And London Tenants Federation members feel strongly that funding for new homes must only be allocated where there is evidence that the landlord is properly maintaining its existing housing stock. Another basic problem that's led to all this situation is that governments for many decades have emphasised housing for sale rather than public housing for rent. And they've fostered the illusion that everyone can become a homeowner, while at the same time housing has become more and more expensive, and the goal of becoming a homeowner has been harder and harder to attain. And instead what we've seen is the growth of the expensive, insecure, poorly regulated private rented sector. And at the same time, the stock of social rented housing has become sadly depleted. London Tenants Federation believes that this is the chief reason for the housing crisis. Our analysis of government data reveals that London's social rented housing stock was 75,300 less in 2019 to 20 than in 2000 to 2001. 100,000 social rented homes, 100,000 social rented homes were built, but 175,300 were sold or demolished or converted to less affordable rent. So this is the background to these problems that are receiving such wide publicity in the press.
Okay, I understand that. All I'll just say to all of you is we've got a number of questions to get through. We need to try and just make the answers a little shorter while wanting you to get your points across. Of course we do. And just two questions, just a fairly brief answers, because we can explore them in more detail. First of all, the government published its social housing white paper in 2020. It's now going to legislate. Do you think that's going to deal with the most important issues? Without going into great detail about them all, what's your just general view about that? Let's start with Suzanne first this time.
Thanks. No, absolutely not. I don't think that will deal with the issues. I think there are a number of weaknesses really, and things like that. For example, the emphasis on monitoring and publishing information. Might be useful, obviously, for the regulator, to go to the regulator, but it's not really going to do anything for tenants. It's not going to speed up the process for them of getting issues addressed. For example, if one of the requirements had been that neighbourhood managers were reintroduced, nearly every association has done away with neighbourhood managers. They were an absolutely key link. And one of the biggest reasons I think that there has been this deterioration and that you've certain estates have been allowed to sink. We've seen a really massive decline. I mean, for example, in London and Quadrant, we would say we have a really massively disproportionate number of complaints about their disrepairs, and that really has escalated as they've done away with the neighbourhood managers or given people. So no, we don't have any. The best thing about that paper is really the extension of the Freedom of Information Act or a similar sort of act. Of course. We would say that's one good thing to come out of it.
Pat, just on the point, does it cover the key points? If not, what would you want to see in it, just briefly?
Well, do you know, I think I've already answered this question.
Right, okay. That's fine. That's a helpful answer then. Okay, yes, on the Darren as well. So what's your view?
Yeah, I mean, for certain that I share some of the concerns that my panel colleagues have about the white paper, and not least also the length of time it's taking to even come to be given the parliamentary time to have an airing. Without doubt, though, it does contain some things which if you were to ask sort of 2, 3, 4 years ago about are these positive improvements, there are a series of things which should represent a start of some progress. And the kinds of things where I'm referring to there is the removal of the serious detriment test, for instance, on the regulator, its ability to be able to proactively regulate consumer side matters, which they've had one arm tied behind their back for a long period of time. The increased access to information, increased transparency, they're all good things that should, on their own merit, is difficult to criticise and should lead to some progress. I think it's only the initial starting point. Undoubtedly, there is significant cultural change that needs to happen across the sector. There is no provision within it for a national platform for tenants in policy decision making, and in relation to the kind of stigma, if you compare the white paper to the earlier green paper and discussions around stigma, there's very little around. Well,
we're going to come on to stigma in just the next round of questions, I think. And just finally from me, again, very briefly, if we can go around, there's been a bit of an explosion in some places of these claims management companies who some people might think are ensuring that the money that should be going in repairs is actually going into the lawyers' pockets. What's your view about them? Have you got experience of them? Pat, do you want to have a brief comment on those?
I don't have any experience of them, but I can just imagine what they're up to. I'd just like to say again that the best defence for tenants is properly organised tenants organisation.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Darren?
Yeah, some anecdotal evidence. They tend to prey on areas where tenants are most vulnerable in receiving the poor service. And in some respects, the best way of defending against it is to make sure you've got high quality services in the first place, isn't it? And good quality accommodation.
Suzanne, anything to add?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, this is something we are really concerned about, the narrative around these. I mean, I think you're talking about the sort of no win, no fee lawyers and those
exactly.
kind of
Yes.
disrepair claims. There was a paper that was leaked to Shack from Riverside, from a senior within the Riverside organisation, that showed that Riverside and a number of other housing associations wanted, because they were losing so many claims or settling them out of court, that they were going to try and get the law changed to make it so that there would be a cap on the amount that people could get for disrepairs claims. And Riverside even admit, the executives even admit, that legislation is there to protect from unscrupulous landlords, and they obviously don't see themselves as being an unscrupulous landlord, but nonetheless have put together a group of organisations, including TAROE and several other big housing associations, to lobby to get this kind of narrative going, that it's just really all down to these disrepair lawyers, when in actual fact the problem is that people are desperate to get their housing repairs done. What Riverside doesn't seem to do, it's very concerned about the amount it's having to pay out in compensation. It doesn't seem to think, the executive didn't seem to consider a solution which was actually about making sure people's homes were in a good state of repair. So I don't think that it's the disrepair claims lawyers. I mean, I think they're quite parasitic in some ways, but I don't think that they are the source of the problem. I think this is a narrative being developed by Riverside and by other housing associations so that they can get the law changed and so that all tenants will end up with fewer rights as a result.
Okay, right. Well, I'm sure Riverside may have something to say about that in due course if they wish. But I think during the lockdown there was certainly a growth of some of these organisations going around to tenants throughout the country. Right. Now, we mentioned the whole issue of stigmatisation. Rachel Hopkins is going to come on to that issue.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks. So, particularly since the Grenfell Tower fire, there's been quite a lot of discussion around the marginalisation of tenants' voices and the possible stigmatisations of those in social housing, and whether this might have contributed to the culture and where requests for repairs and maintenance are ignored. So do you think there is a stigma attached to social housing? And if so, has it played a part in the recent cases of poor service quality from housing providers? Suzanne, you're just at the top of our screen.
Yeah, I mean, there is this tendency sometimes from amongst you do get it from staff working in, the bodies themselves, the housing associations or other bodies. There is a bit of a tendency to feel that people who are in social housing somehow should just be grateful to have a place to live, really, and they shouldn't complain about the state of their homes, and somehow, they're not as deserving of a decent place to live. Whereas actually, that would be something that we would argue very strongly against, that attitude was appropriate. But I think it is all part of the narrative. I think it is all part of this justification. I don't think it's driving. I think it's commercial interests and economic interests that are driving driving down standards in social housing. But I think that is the part of the narrative that is put out that helps kind of excuse it, really, and is one way of rebutting it. Well, they're just social housing tenants, so they don't, they're getting something for free, which obviously is not the case. They often are paying very high amounts of their salaries, of their income towards this housing. And even if they're not, even if it's being paid through the benefit system, they still deserve, 100% service, really, without any sort of reduction or being second-class citizens.
Thanks. Pat, do you want to go next?
Yep, fine. Well, we had a meeting, London Tenants Federation had a meeting last year on this whole question, the question of stigma, and we had presentations by academics who'd studied it historically and in the present day. What we fundamentally decided was that the negative portrayals of council tenants and council estates, which have been spread through the mass media, have been part of a deliberate policy to reduce the amount of social rented housing and replace it with housing for sale. Along with that, we've got the effect of the slogan of mixed and balanced communities, which suggested that council housing estates and council tenants described as single tenure were a bad thing. When actually, in fact, when a third of us used to live in council housing, estates were socially mixed in any case. And that slogan, the mixed and balanced communities, became an excuse for regeneration. And there are many examples of it, of how it's happened. The Haygate estate is probably the most crass example, where there were 1,200 council homes, and now it's been redeveloped with much denser housing, but only 79% of it is social rented. And then you've got the image, which was used, that image of the negativity of social rented housing or council housing was used to promote so-called affordable housing instead of what was council housing, so that now we have to use the term social rented housing to distinguish it from these other types of what's described as affordable housing. And unfortunately, developers and housing associations and councils can claim to be meeting their obligations to build housing for people's needs by building affordable rent or shared ownership properties, which are actually unaffordable to people on median and low incomes. And I think we need to remember that there was a time when council housing was something to aspire to, when people wanted it. And actually, there are millions of people today who probably would give their eye teeth for a council home, despite all the negative images. And I myself have lived on council or mixed council housing association estates for large parts of my life. And my neighbours are just normal citizens like everybody else who pay for their homes, deserve a decent and nice home just like everybody else. And that's what we should be putting across. We should be putting across that last year it was the 100th anniversary of the first council homes, and actually our borough, Hackney, had a celebration of it. And lots of people did celebrate and told stories of how important their council homes had been to them. And I think this is the image that we have got to put across to counter these negative stories.
Thanks, Pat. And Darren, do you want to add around any points on stigma?
Yes, please, if I may. Definitely support what my two colleagues have just stated. In terms of the lack of content in the white paper relative to the green paper, I hope that the government hasn't placed stigma as something in the box of too difficult to do. For undoubtedly, there are wider societal issues about references to sink estates and feral children, and all very unhelpful narratives there. Hopefully, the sector can respond with positive counter narratives, and I think that there's a responsibility there of the sector, and that includes politicians and sector leaders to promote some of the positives. I think recent rhetoric has been unhelpful, even down to the white paper about seeing social rented sector as a stepping stone into home ownership, and the obsession with home ownership is really unhelpful, particularly when you look at some of the juxtaposition of the investment in home ownership relative to social rented within policy. I think if you had a stronger, more empowered tenant collectivist movement, if you had a national platform where they were present at the decision-making tables, then that could address some of those issues so that the sector itself can showcase. And then finally, I think just for TAROE Trust, even the name social housing has some negative connotations. We prefer regulated housing sector, but I know that's a matter for debate.
Thank you. You mentioned the white paper there, and so the social housing white paper proposes a whole bunch of measures to make providers more accountable to tenants, particularly a set of tenant satisfaction measures, which the Regulator of Social Housing is currently consulting on, and the new power, equivalent to that under the Freedom of Information Act in respect to public bodies to get information. What do you think of these proposals? I'll start with Darren there.
Yeah, firstly, an initial disclosure is that we were part of a working group that assisted and contributed to the Regulators working group that was developing the draft tenant satisfaction measures. I mean, generally speaking, it's hard to be able to criticise making information and metrics in this way available to the public to hold landlords to account. positive thing. I guess there are some questions about the methodology and gaming of the system, which to a degree the methodology can kind of address some of those concerns, but not entirely. I guess the bigger question is that this is only a kind of what I wouldn't want us to do is to get obsessed with that. It's kind of as a peripheral matter in some respects to the broader issue of actually accountability. Yes, it's part of the picture, but in order to for it to work, you need strong tenant bodies to hold the landlords to account in the first place, to be able to review those metrics and to do something with them. If they're just issued there and nothing comes of it, then it's really rather unhelpful, isn't it? So I think it's part of a broader system which should be designed to increase accountability. And I'm hoping we'll come back to it. I won't dominate now. Hoping we will have opportunities to come back to about accountability mechanisms as well.
Thank you. Pat, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah. Well, we've got these tenant satisfaction measures at the moment. I think probably every housing association and council operates them, and they're largely tick box exercises. What we would like is that all the landlords help, support and foster tenant self-organisation, instead of making tenants who want to self-organise jump through hoops in order to be recognised by the landlord and making it difficult for them, which is often what happens at the moment. That's the key point, tenant self-organisation, and we'd like all the landlords, housing associations and so on to support it.
Thanks. And Suzanne?
Yeah, I think, very similar to that. Without fail, anyone that we've talked to about this, any of our members that we've talked to has just shrugged their shoulders and said, how will this help me? I can't see that it empowers tenants in any way. I mean, you mentioned there about that, this will, it's there to make landlords more accountable. Our question would be, well, how does it make them more accountable? They still can't, the tenant satisfaction could be high or it could be low. There's still nothing that the tenant can actually do to drive those up. And the tenant isn't concerned with averages across its landlord. Tenants are concerned with what is happening with them, with their particular situation. If you have, a boiler that hasn't worked for 6 months, the fact that most boilers are fixed within 5 weeks is not really, relevant to you. It doesn't make any difference. These are all going to be statistics that are being reported by the landlords themselves. There is no attempt to actually get information from tenants and residents about how their landlords are performing. This is just self-reporting, and then these landlords are going to be taken at their word. So it is, in our view, woefully inadequate in terms of, empowering tenants. It really doesn't. Holding landlords to account, it really doesn't help them actually do that. I can't see how it could be argued that it will.
Thank you there, Suzanne. My final question, there have been accusations recently of racism in the social housing sector, including from residents who feel they've been discriminated against because of their ethnicity. Do you think some of the recent examples of this poor service can be attributed to racism? I'll start with you again, Suzanne.
Yeah, I mean, again, L&Q, we had the Lara Tay case. I think racism is an issue. Certainly, it seems to be a factor that people are, the responses of certain landlords does actually take account of the race, if people are migrants and all of those other kind of perceptions that they might have about the tenant or resident, however accurate or inaccurate. The other big discrimination that we find is against tenants and residents who are disabled, and particularly those with mental health problems. So there's two kind of areas where I think the Equality Act is regularly breached, and we would say that's on racism and in relation to disability. And again, very, very, very difficult for the tenants and residents concerned to actually do anything about it.
Thank you. Pat, do you want to add anything?
Well, just to say that we would like the landlords and their employees to treat every tenant with respect. That's what we would really like.
Thank you. And Darren, thanks.
If racism is driving it, it's abominable, isn't it? And people should be held to account if that is the case. We've got no room for that in society. I suppose I should also highlight some of the structural and societal systems as well. Are kind of they're set up to disadvantage certain groups. you know, positive action at times is going to be necessary to address some of these things.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Rachel. Moving on now to issues of commercialisation of providers. Mary Robinson.
Thank you, Chair. In all your written submissions, you all said that the commercialisation of the social housing sector, partly in response to reductions in central government funding as well as its role in delivering new affordable homes, had contributed to the problems of poor quality. Could you each say a little bit more about that? And probably a good place to start would be, what's your definition of commercialisation? Pat?
Well, yeah, good question. What is our definition? Well, I want to again start with a policy matter. The government and the London, the government and the Greater London Association have set huge house building targets, aimed for large numbers of units to be built, regardless of whether they meet most people's housing needs or not. And what's actually happening is that huge swathes of London are being taken up with high-rise blocks of investor properties instead of the social rented homes that we actually require. And another problem we had was when over 1 million council homes were handed over to housing associations, mainly in the decade from the year 2000. At that time, promises were made to the tenants in the stock transfers, and these promises are not being kept. So that what it looks like now, and this is where the question of commercialisation comes in, is that some large housing associations are just seeing their social rented homes as a kind of asset base on which to borrow large amounts so that they can build housing for sale in the private market. I mean, we could go into the history of how the housing associations got all these properties and what promises were and were not made at the time. In a way, I could see all this happening because we were told at the time that the funding they were getting to incentivise their takeover of these properties was not going to last forever. And we could see that that's happening. And we can see what the results are that I've just described. But I think if you look at the Mayor of London's allocations of the Affordable Homes Programme 2021 to 26, you can see the priority of some housing associations and councils is not necessarily the building of social rented housing. It's building other types of what's called affordable housing. And of course, you can't even see in those figures how much market housing for sale to investors is being built as well. And I know that councils are becoming developers of housing largely sold to investors because of the reductions in their government grant, so that they see themselves keeping themselves self-afloat by becoming developers. There's a whole context that's very unhelpful to the maintenance and building of the social rented homes that we need.
Thank you, Pat. Darren?
Yes, thanks. Firstly, to address the question that you asked over about definition, I think if we were to kind of take a dictionary definition of commercialisation, I think that what we're talking about here is about kind of a primary focus on financial gain. And it almost seems anathema that we should be talking about a focus on financial gain from organisations which are meant to be primarily focused on social purpose. I think there are a number of features which we've seen from commercialisation in recent years which have resulted or potentially resulted within some organisations for a deterioration in service. On the one side, you can see where there's the increased leverage of balance sheets in order to secure what might be surpluses, but increasingly is actually just we're talking about debt borrowed against the balance sheet of these organisations, in order to be able to invest and to build. But often those new properties which are being built are, as my panel colleagues have highlighted, might be for affordable rent, they might be from various range of mixed tenure, and they could, and there's no, without doubt, the reduction in capital subsidies and grants that have happened alongside here is a contributing factor to this. What you've also seen is a regulator that has been primarily forced by legislation to focus on economic matters. And then you've seen a kind of an approach from landlord organisations themselves. For instance, looking at models which, on the one hand, might lead to service improvements. For instance, if you can report a repair at 3 a.m. in the morning because you work particular shifts, that could be great for those transactional services. But a lot of the time, those service redesigns are couched in terms of a kind of almost like an Amazon-type model, where we can say, well, if we can push people down this particular channel, that way we can reduce the overall costs of delivering the service, and then we can use those surpluses to leverage more, to do more of these other things. And I think that, combined with them where you've seen the kind of large scale mergers, a lot of tenants feel that they've no longer got a kind of a local presence from their landlord, that there is these kind of large monolithic commercial entities that don't care, and they're not committed and don't understand the local communities in which they live, and then so you know, it's a complex matter. But what you then see is the kind of increased focus at a board and governing level about the kind of professionalisation of board members, and all the time you're seeing this removal from accountability directly to tenants, smaller shareholding members and less accountability to shareholders as well. So it's a whole combination of factors which kind of leads to less accountable bodies who are increasingly under focus from lenders for the large debts that they're holding. And it just seems to be a kind of increasing imbalance away from the interests of tenants.
Thank you. Suzanne?
Thank you. We'd say that I'd agree with a lot of Darren's definition there. We'd say that housing associations are now accountable to investors in the cities, and not. We don't believe that they are really, especially the bigger ones, are accountable. So the commercialisation is that they are not really accountable to government or to any other kind of public sector body. They are accountable to the executive are accountable to the board is answerable to the market really, and not to anybody that is looking after the interests of tenants and residents, we would say, on the whole. Sort of, you see that in the composition of the board members. It's now all about people who have got experience in finance, hedge fund management, development sector, and also in the programme that the associations themselves put forward. We see in the introduction of for-profit providers who are, very clearly that is what they are there for, and have a housing association as a subsidiary within their group. We see in the push towards having development being done by housing associations and not by councils. That investment is not there in councils. We see in the development of products like shared ownership. I mean, a housing association, one of the housing associations where we have quite a strong group of tenants and residents, Hexagon, they applied to the GLA for funding to develop a certain number of social rented units, and were told to reduce those in favour of the number of shared ownership. People don't want shared ownership. That's not what is going to help solve the housing crisis. But that is where they were being pushed, because that's where the funding structure is actually set up. And I think this is again, it's part of what the justification for this commercialisation is. It was really going to help solve the housing crisis. Maybe not the whole solution, but it was certainly going to help towards that. We have seen every aspect of the housing crisis get worse over the last few years. Overcrowding, people not being able to move out of parental homes. I mean, and the state of disrepairs as well. We've seen every problem getting worse. And all of this commercialisation that was going to deliver some kind of improvement has not delivered improvement at all. It's just delivered a lot of what was built with taxpayers' money as council housing is being delivered into the private sector. That's the way that I think we would see it.
Just stay with you there, Suzanne, just to follow up. Sometimes commercialisation is understood as perhaps adding social care or leisure or other non-core activities into the association's business model. Do you see that as positive? Is that part of commercialisation that has got any aspects which is helpful?
I think that was always part. I think those kind of services were always part, and in fact were actually more in the traditional, very old, the George Peabody style of thinking about how they actually developed housing. That was always part of it. It was never just about the homes themselves. It always was about how they actually develop communities and make nice places to live, where you reduce the kind of social problems that a lot of that sort of period was concerned about. So when you look at their missions, they were always about doing that. I don't think this is something that has come to us with commercialisation. I don't even think it's particularly increased. A lot of times when new estates are built, I don't think that, what our tenants who end up living on there tell us is that those don't include enough in terms of facilities. A lot of the halls where tenants and residents used to meet, a lot of those have been taken back into use by the landlord rather than being left at the, for the use of communities. Over and over again, we hear that people have lost their one meeting space on their estate or in their tower block. So I don't think this has been delivered through commercialisation at all. No, that's really not what we've seen.
Darren, just to slightly different, but building on that, some of the arguments are that it should all return to the previous model, and that would be the best way forward. But there is an alternative action, course of action, which would be a more commercial mindset with a strong focus on customer service as being the best way to ensure high quality provision. Is there any merit in that?
So was that to me?
It was. If you want to have a go at it.
Okay. I think what I would have is reservations in relation to the kind of. I think what you're alluding to is the issue of kind of customers and consumers relative to tenants, and there's certainly. I think that there's been a big movement in recent years to refer to tenants as customers and to consumers of products. When we know, even looking back to the Cade Review of Regulation in 2007, one of the reasons and rationale for us to have a regulator is because there isn't the level of choice. People can't walk with their feet. It's not like going to a supermarket. So I think that in itself is to kind of ignore the legal identity and both the rights and responsibilities for both the tenant and the landlord that comes with being a tenant. So I would have some concerns about that kind of shift to consumers. That isn't to say that there aren't things that can be learned from providing good quality customer service. But what I would say is that perhaps the best way of ensuring you deliver good quality customer service is to have tenants invested in co-creating the services that are being delivered, so that you fully understand the tenants' needs and requirements.
Finally, Pat, would you have anything to add to that?
No, not really. I mean, I don't see that commercialisation has offered any real improvements for tenants' conditions at all. So that's really my point of view on that one.
Thank you very much.
You move on now to look at the role and performance of the Housing Ombudsman in all this. Matt Vickers.
When tenants have exhausted their landlord's complaints procedure, they can refer their complaint to the Housing Ombudsman. How would you assess the performance of the Housing Ombudsman, Suzanne?
For us, I think when the Housing Ombudsman gets involved, then things have really gone quite far down the line. I think it's very, very difficult to make something like the Ombudsman truly accessible. It depends on people having a lot of time. You would have to really sort of make it a level playing field, which is what you would want to see. You'd have to really address the huge asymmetries that you've got of time. The landlord has the time to actually rebut or deal with anything that tenants or residents are saying. It can allocate staff to preparing papers and preparing answers. The tenants and residents are trying to do this alongside any full-time job that they've got, alongside any family commitments that they've got to actually take a complaint forward. So there is a massive asymmetry there. there's the asymmetry of money, obviously, that the landlords have far more by way of resource. So if they need to do research, whatever they need to do, if they need to hire big barristers, they can do that. And again, tenants and residents don't have the access to that kind of resource. And also to information, it almost totally relies on information that is given by the landlord themselves. So if you want to complain about the fact that your service charges are skyrocketing and are absolutely extortionate, you first have to get information from the landlord about what those service charges are. And even that basic information is sometimes not forthcoming. So I think, you would really have to put a lot of support mechanisms in around the Housing Ombudsman. I'm not saying that the Housing Ombudsman isn't doing what it should be doing in relation to, its remit, but it's where that remit is set and what support mechanisms are given to tenants and residents so that that service is actually accessible to them. And obviously, I mean, we've heard that it's taking about 8 months. I don't know if this is true, but about 8 months for cases to be assigned. I think there is a question about resourcing for the Ombudsman so that cases are taken up much more quickly. And then the final thing I think is really, really important is around the sanctions. I mean, I had a look at the cases that were being taken to the Ombudsman, the findings, the decisions that were made. And you look at, just out of the list of top 10, there was Live West, which was fined £400 on a turnover of 186 million. One Manchester, £350 compensation on a turnover of 60 million. And it just went down the list like that. These sanctions are nothing to a housing association when they count their income, their turnover in hundreds of millions. The number of cases, even if you added all the entire cases in 1 year, it's still, financially better for a housing association to ignore these findings and just get fined for them than it would it would cost them to actually address the problem in the first place. So I think there is a question about, how meaningful those sanctions can be, really, because they're not named and shamed. They don't care about their public reputation anymore, it seems. So really, what is there that is actually driving improvement? In what way can the Ombudsman drive improvement? And I think you would really have to step up access, make it much more accessible to people, and then step up the sanctions that the Ombudsman, and we would say this about the regulator as well, that the regulator can actually apply against housing associations that don't comply with what they're supposed to do.
Thank you very much. And Pat, anything to add on that?
Really the priority is dealing with the root problems that eventually lead desperate people to resort to the Housing Ombudsman, isn't it? So investing government money in the upkeep and construction of social rented homes would improve the quality as well as the quantity of social rented housing available. And we've got a suggestion. We suggest that the government should commission a full analysis to identify the shortfall between what's needed to properly manage and maintain social rented homes and what exactly social landlords are setting aside for this. There was an analysis like that done, commissioned from the Building Research Establishment in respect of council housing in 2003. So we think that should be done now. And if there are genuine shortfalls, as opposed to the fact that the landlord has simply not chosen to invest, then the shortfalls should be covered by central government in the same way as the Decent Homes programme was organised. But we also think that there's a need for housing associations to have a ring-fenced account to hold rents and service charges along the lines of the council housing revenue accounts. And that would ensure that all the funding collected is spent on the management and maintenance of existing homes and not, for example, on developing new homes. Now, I said that councils have got these ring-fenced housing revenue accounts, but it's to be hoped that all councils are also using their housing revenue accounts in the proper manner. I say this because there was a recent case that was reported in Inside Housing, the disturbing case of Nottingham City Council, where money accumulated since 2014 to 15 from the housing revenue account had been incorrectly credited to the General Fund for all council services. And from the report, it looked as if this only came to light when there were rigorous checks on the council because they got into financial difficulty. So that is quite a worrying circumstance. Just to go back to the question of complaints, the extended complaint systems that landlords institute frustrate tenants, and they seem designed to wear them down until they choose to just live with the problem that requires repair rather than persisting in trying to get it solved. I just want to give one small example from quite a long list, and that's a recent case on the estate where I live, where it took 3 months of repeated emails and phone calls, both from the tenant and from me as the chair of the Tenants and Residents Association, to get a repair done, which took only 20 minutes. And that's not unusual. And this was a repair that was seriously inconveniencing the whole household. Just finally, though, we definitely agree that extending freedom of information rights to tenants of housing associations would at least give them the same rights as council tenants. But to be realistic, a London Tenants Federation member's experience of freedom of information requests is that it can take a long time to get an answer. And even then, the information wanted can be denied for one reason or another, often commercial confidentiality. And I fear that housing associations in particular would use that excuse to deny the information to their tenants.
Yeah, but before you continue, Matt, I'm sorry, just to say in future, could we now keep the answers specific to the questions and reasonably short, because we are running out of time and I want to get through the final subject as well. Matt.
And Darren, anything to add on the performance of the Ombudsman?
I'll be succinct. Overall, its force were good. There has been some improvements in the service for sure, particularly with the naming and shaming case study, thematic reports, performance reporting, reduction in processing times. But ultimately, the long processing times are of kind of 6, 7, 8 months on average, which is even after having already had to exhaust the internal complaint resolution mechanisms. Is just a really long time. It puts tenants off. Who wants to put themselves through that? Even if they do, a lot of tenants are unaware of the service, and then when they get to the outcome, they find for 18 months of kind of turmoil, they get awarded £250, which bears kind of no resemblance to the misery they've experienced. And I think that's kind of sums up. It's great, but ultimately, there needs to be more fundamental cultural change within the organisations to really address service quality.
We've sort of touched on resources, we've touched on the scale of sanctions. The new Housing Ombudsman scheme gives the Ombudsman new powers to issue complaint, hand in failure orders. Does this go far enough? Are there any other specific powers you'd like to see, as well as more resources and greater sanctions? It's open to anybody, actually. I think anybody else.
Shall I just come in? I guess there's the kind of the meshing with the increased and wider powers of the regulator as well, in order to be able to kind of identify where the problems at an earlier stage and address them. I think I'd come in. Cheers.
I think, sorry, is it all right for me to come in? Yeah, I think what we would like to see is some kind of growing scale of sanction against housing associations. We had a lawyer speak to us, a housing lawyer speak to us, who said that a huge proportion of his cases are going back into court or going back to the Ombudsman, for example, representing members who have had, maybe compensation awarded to them, or even massive refunds. It might be a refund for an entire estate of £60,000, and 4 years later, the money still hasn't come back. So they can, where the bodies that can make orders, obviously the regulator can't, but the first tier tribunal and the Ombudsman can make orders. Where those orders aren't complied with, there should be much, much stiffer sanctions for housing associations who don't comply with those orders. And at the moment, they just get another order made against them and maybe a bit more compensation added for a bit more inconvenience. But it's really not enough to push these associations, particularly where economically it's cheaper for them to just keep breaching the order than it is to actually address the problem that was the source of the complaint in the first place.
Yep.
Briefly.
Just really quickly, Chair, just on that, obviously you've cited some of the investigations, Danny Hewitt's one at ITV, there's another activist, Quadro Tribenas, and it's getting to a stage where even with the Ombudsman complaints and the fines, unless some of these associations are named and shamed on social media, there seems to be no change. Why, instead of the multiple fines, do you think that some of these housing associations just fail to carry out the basic repairs? Tenants continue to pay their rent and their service charges, but yet they refuse to carry out those repairs. Why do you think that is?
Very briefly, please, because I need to move on. Go on. Big question, but short answers.
I think it's probably a culture of disdain within some organisations, and they know that if they don't act, there are limited repercussions and limited accountability.
There you have it. Thank you.
Suzanne. Can I just answer that? I would say it's all about the economics. I think if they don't perform for their shareholders by increasing their surpluses year on year and increasing their very wide operating margins and things like that, it's the economic metrics that they care about. And if there is a real penalty for them, because obviously debt could be repriced or they won't get the investment in the future. So that's the real sanction for them, and that's why they will follow that making sure that their investors are happy. There is no sanction for them that actually pushes them into making sure people are living in habitable housing and decent housing and are treated fairly. So I think it's a question of the economic system driving a particular outcome.
Thank you.
Can I just add that it looks to me, from the reports I've heard, as if this whole system of regulation is directed more towards the financial viability of the landlord organisations than to the service that they're providing for their tenants. Yeah. And that, of course, is an incentive for exactly what Suze has just been describing.
That leads very appropriately on to the issue of the regulator of social housing. Bob Blackman.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Clive. In relation to the regulatory regime, obviously it's overseen by the regulator of social housing. Is it fit for purpose at the moment? No. I don't mind who starts, but
I'm happy to go in if that.
Go on then. Yes.
Yeah, okay. I think we should recognise that overall the need for a regulator, that it's a force for good, that it's actually fulfilled a good role in the last 10 years in terms of economic regulation, which legislation has put in place to say that is its primary focus. The kind of the travesty and reason why it fundamentally isn't fit for purpose is you've kind of got this metaphorical rope around one of its arms, which has said, look, you can only get involved in consumer side matters if there's a risk that matters presented breach the serious detriment test, which kind of is like, well, unless somebody's life and limb is under threat, then you can't really intervene and get involved. So there's a whole range of standards.
Just to cut across you, so is that the barrier to actually making this regime a success?
It's one of the fundamental obstacles for the regulator to be able to conduct effective regulation in the whole. What
other barriers are there from your perspective?
There's a need for I've mentioned it on a number of occasions about the need for cultural change as well. And I think if there's a strong regulator which is not just fulfilling effective regulation, but it's visibly carrying out effective regulation. It's that visibility to tenants as well, because a lot of this happens behind the scenes. That without that visibility, there's the confidence of tenants that don't.
So how would the regulator show that visibility then?
So they need to be able to exercise their powers. And to be able to publish the exercise of those powers in the public domain, and require the landlords to clearly articulate that to tenants themselves. Say, look, we've made things wrong. This is what we're going to do. So it's about accountability, and there are additional accountability mechanisms that you can put in place there as well. Shareholding, wider shareholding membership. We've seen mutual models brought about for housing associations as well.
Okay, so in terms of what our investigation, obviously the government has said they will remove that serious detriment test. Is that all they need to do? Is there anything else that you would want the government to do to get us to? And I'll come to our other panelists in a minute, if I may.
It is a good start, and it will give a range of powers as well.
The problem with these things is that it takes a long time to do these things, and we only get probably one bite at the cherry to actually make it right. So I'm happy if you want to come back to us and suggest any other changes you could make. Suzanne, do you want to make any comments?
Yeah, I worked for the Regulator for Social Housing for nearly 20 years. I worked. I don't work there now, obviously, but I worked there from the days when it was the Housing Corporation. And in those days, I think it used to be more even before I joined, but we regulated 5 areas: governance, finance, management, development, and tenant engagement. We regulated across all of those areas and graded housing associations on all of those areas. Now it has reduced, as Pat said, to finance and governance really only in as far as it affects the finance of the organisation. That's all the focus has been reduced to. So if it's not fit for purpose, one of the reasons, and I don't think it would ever be able to do what government has set out, as being its remit within the powers that government has then actually, within the tools that government has actually given them to do it. It relies almost entirely in regulating. It relies almost entirely on the word of the housing association of going to, in some cases they actually go and view board meetings, but obviously those are big kind of set piece meetings, that are quite tightly controlled. And so what people will get to see is very, very tightly controlled. The inspection regime was cancelled. It was cancelled in 2011. So there is no inspection regime now in the way that there is for schools, for colleges, other parts of the public service. There is nothing now, despite the fact that these organisations get massive amounts of money from the taxpayer. There is no way of actually inspecting or scrutinising how that's being sent. So
what changes would you like the government to make then? Because we're going to make recommendations, so we're keen to hear what suggestions you would make that we could make to government.
I think that one of the most sort of damaging things has been this switch to negative assurance rather than positive assurance, whereas instead of being able to ask for evidence that a housing association is doing something, they just take it for read that they're not, unless there is some kind of red flag. And I think it has to be far more proactive. I think they do need to expand the number of areas, so reduce those cuts that were made over the years, and expand the number of areas that the regulator can look at, and to give them sanctions. Again, it has to be about the sanctions, like what can the regulator do if a housing association is breaching its standards? The system of downgrades, which is all it's got, it can't, except in very, very narrow circumstances, it relies on the kind of downgrade system. We downgrade their governance, or we downgrade their financial viability. And that is only a signal. Really, it doesn't do anything except send a signal to the city that maybe their investment is not as solid as they might have thought it was. And it's the city that the investors who then put pressure on the landlord, hopefully, to change. It's a very indirect system of enforcement, if you like. We need to have something which is a much more direct and robust system of enforcement to give the regulator the tools to do their job properly, I think.
Okay, all right, thanks. Pat, what would you like to see in the way of regulation?
Well, I would like you to look at all the things that we've mentioned in all my
but let's be specific.
Because
the role of the regulator and regulation, please.
If you don't sort those things out, it doesn't matter what system of regulation you've got, it's not going to work. As far as the actual system goes, I think Suz has got years of experience of different systems of regulation. And maybe you should take on some of the things that she's been talking about. From the point of view of London Tenants Federation, we feel that the problem is there's a complete imbalance of power between the power the tenants have, and the power that the landlords have. And as long as that imbalance exists, a system of regulation is not going to sort it. So we'd just like to refer you to our manifesto for a positive future for social housing in London, which is on our website, where we say that tenants should have rights to organise collectively and to take a full and equal part in the decisions made about their homes from the local to the national level, and that these rights should be enshrined in law and enacted in practice. So maybe a change in the law might be something you might like to propose.
Okay, all right, thank you very much. I'll leave it there.
Okay. Thank you, Bob. Thank you all very much for coming this afternoon and sharing with us your views and your experiences of the situations that you found it, the difficulties, the problems, the inadequacies of the current system, and that's what we'll now be reflecting on when we listen to other witnesses and then eventually do a report with recommendations. So thank you all very much for coming and giving your views to us this afternoon. We move on now to our second panel.
Thank you.
Who are with us.